Our next session will focus on the future of Nabers and Nabers Energy Project. Our speaker, Corinne Mullet, is Technical Projects Manager at Nabers and focuses on improving existing Nabers tools. Prior to her current role as Nabers, she worked on the development of the online Nabers waste platform. She holds a degree in engineering and has previously worked for an engineering solutions company and an environmental consultancy. Corinne's presentation will be followed by a Q&A opportunity led by Steve Hennessy, CIBSE's representative on the Nabers Steering Committee. So please join me in welcoming Corinne to the stage. Hi, Corinne.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much. So I think you should all be able to see my screen. If that's not the case, please shout out to me. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak at this CIBSE seminar. Nabers is really pleased to be able to share and what the work that we're doing and to keep everyone updated on the future of Nabers Energy Project in particular and the changes that will be happening in the not so distant future with Nabers Energy. So really pleased to be here. So the future of Nabers Energy Project is one that started 12 months ago, and it has been focusing on looking at how Nabers should be adapting and changing in line with the evolutions and trends that have been happening in our property and energy markets. So as part of this project, we have a specific defined scope of the types of exactly what changes we've been looking at adapting Nabers to, and I'll just run you through all of these changes, all of these evolutions that have been happening in the market now. So the first thing that we've been looking at is the fact that there is an increased amount of renewable energy generation in Australia, and this has been increasing over the past couple of decades, and it's led to the electricity grid being more decarbonised than it used to. And we've been looking at what Nabers needs to do to kind of really reflect the decarbonisation of the grid in the Nabers Energy Rating tool. We've also been looking at the fact that, well, there's a lot more property groups now who have been looking at having net zero targets. A number of property groups that we that are Nabers ratings users are committed to achieving net zero for their portfolios in the next decade or so. We've also been looking at the fact that the way organisations have been procuring renewable energy has evolved over time, and we have more and more companies interested in power purchase agreements. So this is a topic that I won't cover today, and it's the same with the next one, the updating updates to the carbon accounting methods. But if you would like to hear more about those, or you'd like to get an in-depth update on what we're doing with that, please do get in touch with me, perhaps at the networking after this presentation, or you can get in touch with me via email, and you'll see my email address on the very last slide. The last topic that we've been delving into as part of this project is the fact that carbon accounting methods have evolved over time. They've become more robust, and they've really looked at avoiding double counting in the carbon accounting. And so we've been looking at how Nabers could really align with the international carbon accounting methods to become a more robust carbon accounting tool. And this is in particular for the Nabers Energy with green power part of the tool. So like I said, we're going to focus today on the first two topics here. We're going to do a really deep dive into these. The other two topics, please get in touch if you do want to know a bit more about what we're doing in that space. So let's have a look first maybe at how we've been going through this project and who's been involved. We've done quite a bit of consultation and collaboration with industry to find out more and to determine exactly how Nabers should be adapting to these changes. We have a Future of Nabers Energy Technical Working Group who is mainly made up of industry stakeholders who have been there to provide insight and feedback on all of the proposals and options that we've been bringing forwards. We also ran a public consultation in May where we were put out many different options and proposals on all of these topics to really try and understand what the broader Nabers community thinks of all of these possible changes. And we also always work very closely with the Nabers National Steering Committee. This steering committee takes all of the strategic and the big decisions that we have to make in Nabers, and it's made up of the federal government, the state governments, and also a number of peak bodies whose members are really closely linked to Nabers. So moving forwards into the first topic, which is the decarbonisation of the grid, the first thing I kind of need to tell you about is why this actually matters to Nabers and how this impacts Nabers. So when an assessor does a Nabers energy rating, they will go and collect the energy consumption data from the building, and they will enter that into the Nabers rating system. And in that Nabers rating system, emissions factors get applied to the gas and the electricity consumption. And these emissions factors essentially tell us how many units of emissions are generated for each unit of that energy source that is consumed. And they enable us to compare the different sources of energy in terms of the emissions that they'll be releasing. The emissions factors that we use are called the NGA factors, the National Greenhouse Accounts factors, and these are determined, calculated and published by the Commonwealth Government. We then do many more adjustments to these, to this consumption here based on the size of the building, the location of the building, and then it eventually spits out a Nabers energy rating. Now, the emissions factors that we use in Nabers are actually the ones from when Nabers was first, the Nabers energy rating tool was first developed, and that was in 1998. Nabers has made a conscious decision to continue using those same emissions factors to enable users or people who have done ratings to be able to track their performance year on year and to be able to set performance targets in the future without having the influence of an external factor coming to influence their rating. But actually, what has happened is a little bit is quite interesting, that there's been quite a bit of decarbonisation of the grid that's happened with the increase of renewable energy in Australia. So this graph shows this graph shows the emissions linked to the electricity grid over the past 15 years and moving forwards over the next 2 decades. What you can see is that the emissions have reduced over time and that they are planned to continue to reduce. We don't know exactly how they will continue to reduce. All those different coloured lines that you can see moving forwards are the different scenarios based on whether based on how much renewable energy is actually going to be developed in Australia moving forwards. So we can have a look at how this decarbonisation of the grid is actually influencing and changing the emissions factors. So if we look at South Australia as an example, and South Australia is an example that's a bit where you can see the change more than in other states, because South Australia has had a faster decarbonisation than in the electricity grid than in other states. So these are the emissions factors for South Australia in 1998. What you could see is that the gas emissions factor was at 0.21 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour, and the electricity was 0.95. So electricity was about 4 times higher than the gas emissions factor. If we now go to look at the more recent emissions factors, you can see how these have changed. So the gas emissions factor has pretty much stayed the same. It's gone from 0.21 to 0.22, whereas the electricity emissions factor has reduced. It's gone from 0.95 to 0.54. So we've gone from 4 times more to about 2.5 times more between the electricity and the gas. And that's actually quite an interesting change in the comparison that we can see. Now, why does this actually matter in Nabers ratings? Well, we'll have a look now, continuing with the example of South Australia. Let's take just a standard this is an example of one building in South Australia that gets just above a 4-star Nabers rating. Here you can see the blue bar is the building with its conventional setup, which would probably be using a gas boiler for the heating. Now, if that very same building, identical building, but changed to use an electric heat pump, you can see that it's going to get, using the current Nabers calculation, using those 1998 emissions factors, you can see that it's going to get a slightly lower Nabers rating using the heat pump, the electric heat pump technology. Now, if we were to update the emissions factors that we have in Nabers, in the Nabers calculation, to the more recent ones, what you would see is actually the heat pump solution would get a slightly better Nabers rating. And that's because we would be acknowledging the fact that the electricity emissions are now reduced compared to those, are now lower compared to those the ones that we used in 1998. So you can see the change here quite clearly using the South Australia example. Unfortunately, the change isn't that clear in other states because we don't have as fast a decarbonisation in other states. The emissions factors in other states have not changed as much. So if we now take an example of New South Wales, what you can see is that we don't have the heat pump in this specific example is not coming out as getting a better Nabers rating than compared to the 1998, than the conventional setup, in both using the 1998 emissions factors and the 2018 emissions factors. But what you can see is that the gap between the two is reducing. So you are seeing the trend changing, but you're not seeing the switch yet from one to another. And that is in this specific example of this specific building with the specific parameters that we've used just to create the example. So let me just move on to my next slide. I thought I'd tell you kind of what this change is actually going to mean for industry. So in July 2021, Nabers will be updating the emissions factors that are used in all Nabers energy rating tools. And this is essentially just to accurately reflect the emissions linked to all different to the different fuel sources, and to accurately compare fuel sources between each other. But this change is going to have a small impact on rating results. Most buildings will see no change in their ratings. Some buildings will see a slight improvement, and those are the buildings that are using a really high proportion of electricity in their energy mix. And some buildings will see a slight reduction in their ratings, and those are the buildings that are using a high proportion of gas in their energy mix. The reason why we're seeing that change is because the comparison between electricity and gas is going to change. The way we're comparing the two fuels is going to change when we update the emissions factors. And the ones, because the electricity emissions factor is lower than what it used to be, the buildings that use a higher proportion of electricity will see a slight improvement, whereas those that use a higher proportion of gas will see a slight decrease in their ratings. The other thing that we'll be doing is reviewing and updating the emissions factors periodically. So every 5 years after next year, we will be updating those emissions factors just to make sure that we are keeping in line and tracking the actual decarbonisation of the grid. So I'm now going to go into a deep dive as to exactly what this, how much the ratings are going to change by. So this is all indicative, obviously, but it really helps to give you an idea. So this is a graph showing how the ratings will change in Victoria. So on the left, you have how the ratings will be using the current emissions factors that we're using, the 1998 ones. So that's the current ratings. And on the right, you will see what the ratings will look like if we were to update, if we were to update those emissions factors. So here you can see that on average, the ratings will not change. And that's because once we update the emissions factors, we will bring the average back to where it was. Now I'm going to bring up a blue line, which is going to show how it's going to impact the buildings that are all electric. What you see is that the all electric buildings will get a really slight increase in their ratings. And now I'm going to bring up two other lines. We're going to see the buildings that use a higher amount of gas. So here you have the buildings that use 40 to 50% gas in their energy mix in orange. You can see that those buildings will see no change in their ratings. These are quite average in their setup. The buildings that use a higher proportion of gas, 60 to 80%, will see a slight decrease in their ratings. And you can see it's a really small decrease. And that's mainly due to the fact that the emissions factors actually haven't changed that much in Victoria. And that's the case also for New South Wales, Queensland, etc. I'm now going to bring up these same numbers, these same graph for South Australia. And you can see that in South Australia, we do see a bigger change in these ratings. So this is the same again. You can see that dotted grey line. That one doesn't change. We will bring the average back to where it was once we update the emissions factors. But what you can see is that the all electric buildings are going to have a slightly, that line is a bit more steep. It will have a slightly bigger change on the all electric buildings, and same for those 40 to 50% gas buildings. They will see a slightly more noticeable decrease. I haven't plotted the 60 to 80% gas buildings because there's just not enough data in South Australia to be able to plot this graph. And all of these graphs, it's trying to show an indication of the change, and this is the average change. Each line shows the average change for that type of building. So moving on, just to this last slide as part of this section is how can I prepare for this change? Now you've heard about it, and possibly this is the first time you're hearing about this change. And well, what we want to do is make sure as many people as possible know that this change is coming. So whether that be the assessors, the building engineers, the facilities managers, or the actual Nabers rating customers, the building owners, or the investors, it's really important that everyone hears about this change. So we will be holding information sessions and attending as many seminars and talking about this as we can. We'll also be providing an information pack to help everyone understand the change and also explain it to their stakeholders. So if you're a Nabers assessor, that you can explain it to your building owners. And the last thing that is really important to know is that we will be putting on our website a rating prediction tool. So we'll be updating the emissions factors in July 2021, but 6 months before, in January 2021, we will be making available a prediction tool on our website where you'll be able to see, just like the Nabers rating calculators that are on our website, you'll be able to enter the data of the building and see what the rating will be in July 2021. We'll also be providing a prediction tool that will give you the Nabers rating in 2030 using projected emissions factors. So these are obviously only projections. We don't know what the emissions factors will be in 2030, but they really will help people understand how these buildings will be performing in 10 years' time. Okay, so I'm sure there are quite a few questions on this. Please do post your questions and I'll be happy to answer them afterwards or in the networking session afterwards. I've just got a couple more slides to talk about net zero. So we've also, as part of this project, been looking at net zero recognition. And before I go into that, I need to tell you exactly how Nabers works, and I'll tell you about the carbon neutral certification that Nabers has. So when you get a Nabers energy rating, let's say you get a 4-star Nabers energy rating for a building, you can also get a Nabers energy with green power rating, which is essentially where you're purchasing green power and you can get an improved star rating, an improved Nabers energy with green power rating. The other thing that you can do is actually look at becoming carbon neutral as well. And that can be done by using that Nabers energy rating. It needs to be a minimum of 4 stars, that Nabers energy rating, and also looking at the water emissions, the waste emissions, and the refrigerants emissions. So the emissions linked to the leakage of the refrigerants from the HVAC systems. And with all of that, you can then buy carbon offsets or renewable electricity for that electricity consumption, and be able to get carbon neutral certification. And that's through the Climate Active scheme, which is run by the Commonwealth Government, but Nabers provides a pathway for buildings to become to have Climate Active carbon neutral certification. Now, we've also been looking at how we can be rewarding buildings that are running on 100% renewable energy. And we've been calling this net zero. Whether or not it will be actually called that when we actually release it, we're not 100% sure. But we've been exploring basically opening up that Nabers energy with green power scale to the 7th star. So Nabers Energy with green power is a 0 to 6-star scale at the moment. And it was always designed, and 6 stars isn't actually 0 emissions. It was always designed that the 7th star would be 0 emissions. And we're looking at basically opening up that 7th star to reward buildings that are running on 100% renewable energy. So it would look like this. There's a lot of work to do on our end to figure out exactly what this will look like. Will it be the 7th star? Will it be net zero recognition? There's also work for us to do as to how we will be calling this. It seems more appropriate to call it net zero energy emissions, because that is exactly what it is. It is the energy emissions that are net zero. So watch this space. It's something that we're exploring, and something that we're really keen to do to help provide recognition and really encourage the procurement of renewable energy, and encourage organizations to go all the way and get the 100% renewables. So that's pretty much it from me. I'm very keen to hear any questions, and I think Steve is probably around, so I'll hand it over to him.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks very much for that presentation. And for those of you that don't know, SIBSI are on the National Steering Committee. Corinne, some interesting points that were raised there, and I'm a bit concerned that a number of the people listening may not yet fully grasp the implications of some of these changes. I've got a question first off from Ken Marr at Arabs, and he's asking that there is green power available. Does that affect the national greenhouse factors for the remaining electricity sold?
I'm just trying to fully comprehend the question.
So green power is not additive, is it?
So green power does not count in the NGA factors. The NGA factors if you're purchasing green power, that will give you a benefit in your Nabers Energy with green power rating, but not in your Nabers Energy rating.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Or I'm not sure I fully understood. I fully answered the question.
Yes, I suppose the inference there is that there is this green power, and if it's not counted towards it, is the grid slightly greener than we think it is?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. So the green, obviously the NGA factors take into account all of that renewable energy that's being generated, and the green power that you would purchase would be additional to that. So yeah, I'm not sure. Keen for a further discussion on that one, because I'm not sure I fully comprehended, but I think we might be getting into the complexities of double counting and additionality that might need further thought.
Ken, I think you can join Corinne in the lounge afterwards and
yes,
and put that to Corinne in person.
Thank you.
We saw this impact of gas, and you spoke about the gas in a building using 40 to 60%. What about a building that's using cogeneration, where the gas figures might be 80% plus?
Yeah. So we did look at those buildings, and owners of those buildings were part of the technical working group. So essentially, if those graphs that I showed you, where you could see a really minimal amount of change in the ratings, for a cogen building, I have also looked at the numbers for a cogen building. So in New South Wales, you'd be seeing on average a reduction of 0.1 of a star. But in South Australia, you'd be looking at an average change of 0.3 star. So obviously a decrease in rating. So yeah, 0.3 stars could start to get possibly concerning for a building owner. But what we did hear a lot from our technical working group is that there is just a real appetite for Nabers to really reflect the emissions, the current emissions factors that are in that are available, and to accurately reflect the decarbonisation of the grid. And that does involve there being a reduction in ratings for buildings that are using a really large amount of cogeneration. But the property owners who were in the room at the technical working group were comfortable with that decision.
Okay. A question from Jeff Robinson. What's going to be involved in getting a Nabers carbon neutral rating?
Yeah, so to get a Nabers carbon neutral rating, you need to get a Nabers energy rating, and that needs to be a minimum of 4 stars. And then that same assessor needs to collect data on the waste, the water, and the refrigerants. So you can get a Nabers energy, Nabers water, Nabers waste rating, and then you're pretty much all the way there to get your carbon neutral certification. But you don't have to do the waste and the water bit through Nabers. You can just collect the waste and water data without it being a Nabers rating. But you do at minimum need a Nabers energy rating. And once you've done that, and it's all done through Nabers. It's lodged through Nabers. It's you put your energy data as a normal Nabers energy rating, so through Nabers rate, and then the rest of the data you provide in a spreadsheet, and it's a climate active carbon neutral spreadsheet. And so there's additional fees in terms of Nabers, and obviously there's additional fees on the assessor side of things. And then the building owner needs to buy carbon offsets, and then they have carbon neutral certification that they can promote.
Okay, and Jeff is also wondering whether Nabers is going to change as the grid becomes decarbonised. Is it an ongoing change, or is this just the one-off in 2021?
Yeah, so 2021 we're making the change, and then every 5 years we will be updating the emissions factors again. But noting that we don't know how fast the grid is going to decarbonise. We have projections, but like you could see in that graph with all the squiggly lines, like there's many projections and we don't know which way it's going to go. So we will also be doing annual tracking of the rate of decarbonisation and what the projections are, and to see if we need to review the frequency of updates. That it's at this stage we don't know, but the 5-year update seems appropriate for now.
Okay, there's a question about whether COVID has had an impact on Nabers, and how will Nabers be taking this into account?
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely COVID has had an impact on Nabers. In terms of the actual ratings, we are seeing, Nabers has put a lot of time and effort in doing what is possible to help assessors continue to do ratings and make doing ratings possible, despite the fact that sometimes site visits aren't possible, etc. So we do have a page on our website about COVID and all of the rulings that have been adapted to help people do ratings. We are also looking at the impact on ratings. So at this point in time, it's starting to become clearer maybe how long this is going to last, although it's not obvious. Initially, we didn't know if it was for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. It looks like it will be the low occupancy in buildings will continue to occur moving forwards, and we're going to be essentially reviewing the impact this is having on Nabers ratings. And I think over the next couple of months we will be doing some consultation to really look at and just start understanding if we need to be making any changes to the Nabers calculations or not. So at this point in time, we don't know if we'll be making any changes to the calculations.
There has been some interesting data, I believe, where waste has dropped dramatically in buildings, but energy hasn't dropped at the same rate.
Yeah, that's right. So what we are seeing is that many buildings maybe are still operating at a certain level in case there are some occupants that are coming into the building or because they're not able to shut down some parts of the HVAC system in some parts of the building. Whereas in waste, it's really obvious. You can really see the dramatic drop in the amount of waste that's being generated, because if there are no occupants, there is just no waste being generated. So it's been really interesting to have that waste data through Nabers waste rating tool to see actually what are the levels of occupancy in the buildings, whereas the energy data doesn't show it as clearly. Okay,
and look, one final question. You spoke about net zero and perhaps net zero energy. Where does embodied energy feature in all of this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So embodied energy doesn't appear in climate active carbon neutral certification, and it's not something that we're looking at in this net zero certification that we're talking about, or the 7th star of Nabers Energy with green power, although it is a very important part of the puzzle. It's not something that Nabers has had a role to play in yet in the past, but it is possible that Nabers will have a role to play in embodied carbon, embodied energy moving forwards. So I wasn't involved in the development of climate active carbon neutral certification, but I do know that a lot of time was spent understanding what would be included in the scope 3 emissions, and it was a lot of discussion. I think it was like the bulk of the development of the carbon neutral certification for buildings was talking about scope 3 emissions and which ones should be included and which ones didn't have to be included. So it's a really complex space. And in terms of what we're looking at with the 7th star, what we can see is that the definition of net zero can be very broad. We have some property owners considering it to be their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Others are including scope 3, but only a couple of scope 3 emissions. So there's not a huge amount of clarity on exactly what the definition of net zero is. We can see the World Green Building Council has limited it to scope 1 and 2 emissions. And what we're seeing is that currently we have the scope 1 and 2 emissions data, and so there is an opportunity now to release a net zero or something like net zero very soon that could have a really big impact. If we go down the path of including embodied energy, then we're not releasing something for a few years yet. So it's just a matter of seizing the current opportunity, but still obviously having in mind that there is possibly a role for Nabers to play with embodied energy and carbon.
Fantastic. Well, look, Corinne, we're pretty well out of time. In fact, we're so far behind time. I don't even know what time is anymore. But
thanks, Steve.
Look, thanks very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think for the people listening, you can be sure that CIBSE will make sure that all these changes are properly communicated to.
Thank you. That would be great.